Hello, everyone. I'm Harvey Brownstone. One of the most popular features of our show is our Gone But Not Forgotten series, in which we honor and celebrate the greatest Hollywood legends. Today's guest is the son of one of the most talented, respected, revered, and beloved cinematic legends and humanitarians, Audrey Hepburn. In classic films like Roman Holiday, Sabrina, War and Peace, Funny Face, Love in the Afternoon, TheNun'sStory, Breakfast at Tiffany's, The Children's Hour, My Fair Lady, Wait Until Dark, and many more, Audrey Hepburn dazzled, inspired, and enchanted us. And she captivated our hearts with her iconic beauty, vulnerability, sincerity, and incomparable empathy, which underscored and motivated everything she did. She received 5 Academy Award nominations and won the Oscar for Best Actress for Roman Holiday. And after her passing, the Academy bestowed the Jean Hersholt Humanitarian Award upon her posthumously, which our guest accepted on her behalf. Audrey Hepburn was one of the first people to be an EGOT winner. She won an Oscar, a Grammy, an Emmy, and 2 Tony Awards. She also won dozens of other awards, including 3 BAFTA Awards and 3 Golden Globe Awards, including the Cecil B. DeMille Award. And the American Film Institute named her the 3rd greatest female screen legend of all time. She was the first celebrity to have her own fragrance called L'Interdit, created by Givenchy in 1967. But beyond all of that, beyond her iconic beauty, glamour, fashion sense, elegance, and warmth, there was Audrey Hepburn, the monumentally generous humanitarian. She was truly the walking definition of the milk of human kindness. She never forgot that immediately after the war, an organization which later became UNICEF brought food, medicine, and clothing to her community in Holland, where she lived as a child during the Nazi occupation. And so, in the last 6 years of her life, as a goodwill ambassador for UNICEF, she made numerous trips to the world's most impoverished and war-torn countries, especially in Africa, advocating passionately and tirelessly on behalf of the children being devastated by disease, famine, and genocide. President George Bush Sr. presented her with the Presidential Medal of Freedom in recognition of her contribution to humanity. And if you go to the UNICEF headquarters in New York, you will see a beautiful statue called the Spirit of Audrey. Our guest, who is the son of Audrey Hepburn and the iconic actor, director, producer, and writer Mel Ferrer, has had a successful career in the film industry for many years. Shortly after his beloved mom passed away in 1993, he and his brother Luca created the Audrey Hepburn Children's Fund, a charity that continues the humanitarian work and honors the legacy of his dear mother. He's been touring the world with his exhibition entitled Intimate Audrey, raising funds for his nonprofit organization. In 2003, he released a wonderfully poignant book entitled Audrey Hepburn, An Elegant Spirit, A Son Remembers, and all of his royalties went to the Audrey Hepburn Children's Fund. And in 2020, he and his wife Karen published Little Audrey's Daydream, a children's book about his mother's childhood in Nazi-occupied Europe. Proceeds from the book benefit the European Organization for Rare Diseases. I'm delighted and deeply honored to welcome Sean Hepburn Ferrer to our show. Sean, thank you so much for being here.
What a joy to be here. Thank you, Harvey.
Sean, I want to begin by reading you something that you wrote in your book. You said, I'm quoting you here, "My mother died in 1993 when I was 33 years old, and she's still everywhere, on television, on streaming platforms, in magazines, bookstores, on huge billboards in airports, and on freeways, on bus stop shelters, in every conversation I have sooner or later with everyone, in my work, in my dreams, and in my thoughts." Sean, what does that feel like to know that your mother's popularity just keeps growing with each passing year?
It has caused me to wonder and ask myself, what is it that makes her, let's call it, permanently viral? And I've been thinking about it now for the past 30 years. And I think that in a world where we're not sure who to rely upon, at an instinctive level, people perceive her as someone genuine. They see her as the girl across the landing who puts on a little black dress and goes out into the world, and we sort of perceive her as, quote unquote, one of us.
Now, you wrote that there was a certain sadness that permeated your mother's personality throughout her life and that it stemmed from her father having abandoned her when she was only 6 years old. Do you think that that sadness, that sense of yearning to be loved, had an impact on her acting style and on her screen persona?
Well, I talked about that as being, it was sort of a gimmick, if you may, without taking anything away from the actual emotional content of that. But it was a gimmick in the fact that I sort of set it up as the big secret, that Audrey Hepburn had a big secret. And in fact, I think there was a sadness. There was a sadness when her father left. There was a sadness when she saw what happened during the war and lived through the longest occupation of World War II, being in Holland. And that sadness went on when she lost a couple of pregnancies. And again, the marriage didn't work and the divorce. And ultimately, I think the greatest sadness, the sort of what capped it all off, was after doing those 5 years as a UNICEF ambassador and seeing how we do not take responsibility for each other in a world that's supposedly globalized. And now I've seen it for the past 30 years, that children are still get a chance or not based on where they are born. And I think we have to take a long, hard look at ourselves as a society and try to determine what is it that makes us prioritize everything else but, the future generations, the future of our planet.
So well said. Your mom had a very difficult and traumatic childhood living in Nazi occupied Holland during the war. Did she ever talk to you about her wartime experiences?
She did, and she did mostly during the years as a UNICEF ambassador, when she would talk about the hunger, not just the physical hunger, but the emotional hunger, the loss of a parent, of the chance at a childhood. And that was one of the main reasons why she fought so hard as a UNICEF ambassador to address those issues.
Your mom was offered the role of Anne Frank in the movie, but she turned it down. Did she ever tell you why?
She did. She felt too close to it. She felt that having lived out a similar experience, obviously, which did not end in the same way, only a few blocks away, because literally they were both in Arnhem during the war, she felt too close, and that she would have had to revisit places and emotions and things that she didn't want to go back to.
Some people described your mom as a steel hand in a velvet glove. Do you agree with that description?
Actually, that was coined by my ex-wife, and I think she was right. She was. I mean, you don't get to be Audrey Hepburn, not just a movie star, not just a symbol of inner and outer elegance, but also the sort of legendary humanitarian who sort of, together with Jim Grant, the executive director at the time, literally turned around an organization which was, still post-war, sort of inching along. And in 5 years, they doubled its size, doubled its income, doubled its number of employees. You don't get to be, still today, 30 years after her passing, and 70 years, this year is the anniversary of her receiving the Academy Award for Roman Holiday. You don't get to do all that by being sort of a wet rag or wet piece of paper. You have to have a real backbone and a lot of strength.
Your mom was one of the most photographed women in the world. How did she cope? And how did you cope, Sean, with all the paparazzi around her?
Well, by the time I turned 5 and went to school, she did something extraordinary, which is probably one of the greatest gifts that she gave both my brother and I. She gave up her career at the top of her game and became a full-time mother. And that's because she wanted to have a family, and she realized that she could only do one thing well at a time. She was a very sort of mindful person in that respect. Yes, she was kind of the last century's queen of Instagram. If you consider the cost involved in taking a single photograph, then the lighting, the makeup, the wardrobe, the actual film. We didn't have digital then. the developing, the tests that were then sent around for approval, and then ultimately the retouching, if any, and then all the mail involved. There was no email and all of that. So probably a single photograph, going through that contact sheet process is probably in present value dollars close to an average cost of a smartphone today. So, and considering that she took thousands, I think she understood, and so did my father, who was there with her and the silent manager of her career, having been handed the baton by my grandmother. I think they understood the value and the power of that media.
But you must be incredibly grateful that you did not grow up as a Hollywood kid like so many other children of celebrities did.
I am. I mean, I don't regret not having grown up in Hollywood, because at the time it was a lovely place, not at all the place it is today. What I'm very thankful for is the values that come with growing up on a farmhouse and going to school with regular kids, and basically inheriting from both my parents, who both came from nothing, what it means.
So did you get treated like a regular kid in school?
Not at first. Obviously, my friends knew that there was something different, and they saw the paparazzi, especially in Rome, when she'd come and get me from school. But pretty soon they saw that I was a normal kid, and it didn't last very long. The teasing didn't last very long.
I'm happy to hear that. Now, looking at your mom's movies, I must tell you that my favorite is Funny Face, because she got to dance with Fred Astaire. But for you, I would imagine that War and Peace is very special because your parents worked together in that movie.
Yes, at the same time, I have to go back to Funny Face. Often people ask me what was important to her, and I guess the answer is films were important for her because they were the beginning of a lifelong friendship. Roman Holiday, Gregory Peck, and Sabrina with Billy Wilder, the director, and so forth and so on. But yes, having wanted to be a dancer herself, there is no doubt that Funny Face gave her a chance to spread her wings, in a way that maybe she didn't expect to ever get a chance to do. And to do it with Fred Astaire, what a joy.
Absolutely. And was War and Peace special to you because both your parents were in it?
I'm a filmmaker myself, so I have to be brutally honest with respect to the cinematic medium. I think it was a good film for the era. I'm not sure it stands up the test of time as well as it should. It's a Hollywood rendition of a classic novel. I think the Russian version is probably better. And my father was a better producer than he was an actor. He was sort of dry and wooden and sort of unemotional at times and a little rigid. And it works there. It works in that particular. That's why he did a lot of stuff in costumes, and he was a great writer and a tremendous swordsman, So still to this day, Scaramouche is the longest sword fighting scene in cinema. Many having tried to sort of knock it off that pedestal. But I think she was delightful in it. I think Henry Fonda was amazing in it, without a doubt. Without him, I think we would not have reached that note which it did at the time. But again, I think there are other films which are, perfect in her career. And this one has a tendency, in my view, to sort of having aged a bit.
The legendary composer Henry Mancini said publicly that he wrote the songs Moon River, Charade, and Two for the Road especially for Audrey Hepburn. And he tried to capture her quality of wistfulness and slight sadness in those songs. And he said that your mother's rendition of Moon River was his favorite, even though there have been well over 1,000 cover versions of that song. Don't you think that's just amazing?
It is. Next year is his 100th, so I'm working together with the family to put together a beautiful tribute, or participating in their tribute to their father. We were just in London a couple of months ago. They were re-recording it. Michael Bublé is going to sing it. So there you go, 1,001 renditions. But there's no doubt he wrote it for her to be able to sing it, because she had a limited range. And so she made up the lack of range with the reading, which is, she got it, and you have to understand it was a small community in those days. Henry did most of the music to her films, and you had the same sort of group of, pals who worked together. So it was a much smaller industry. And once you had a team that worked well, you sort of stayed with it.
There's a myth out there that because your mom and not Julie Andrews got to star in the movie version of My Fair Lady, that there was some kind of animosity between them. But that's totally untrue, right?
It's, she always used to say, I never wrote a biography because I basically had a boring life. There were no skeletons in the closets and no real horror stories and nothing really to tell. And so she never took those huge advances that they used to make in those days for the tell-all sort of biography, terrified that, having realized that there really wasn't much there, they would then say, well, can you give us something on somebody else? And she didn't want to do that. But no, they were great friends. I mean, my mother had a place when I was sent to boarding school in Switzerland. She got a little house in the mountains in Switzerland, in a little town called Gstaad, which today has become again another sort of destination. And Blake and Julie had a house there, and they saw each other regularly. You have to understand, she was offered the role and she turned it down. And then finally they pushed and pushed and pushed. And finally, so she invited everybody, from my father's mouth. She invited everyone to the house. And of course, the executives and Jack Warner came thrilled. Finally, she's going to accept the role. And she basically spent the whole lunch explaining to them why it had to be Julie, because she had the legitimacy, she knew the part, she could sing it, my mother couldn't sing it. And finally they said to her, if you're not going to do it, we're going to get somebody else, but it's not going to be Julie. And finally at that point, after months and months of campaigning on Julie's behalf, Julie knows that. So this story is another story which people like to tell, because otherwise we run out of stuff to print the pages on.
Well, I'm glad we've clarified it here. Sean, you mentioned that your mom retired from making movies really at the height of her career so she could be a full-time mother. Do you think that for your mom, having children was a way for her to heal the pain of her own childhood?
I think it all participates. I think it all plays a role. Certainly, she very much wanted to have that family, because she didn't get that. And I remember my daughter, and I went through a divorce as well. And my daughter saying, I envisioned a family where you sit around the table and pass me the peas. And I remember she used that expression. And then we lost that, and that's what you lose in a divorce. You lose the little stuff. It's not, those vacations in Hawaii that people remember. It's that time that, the lights went off and there was a power outage and you had to, that's why people always talk about those marshmallows, around
The campfire.
The campfire, exactly. So the s'mores, as they call them. So, yes, no doubt. But I think that's also what caused her to made her who she was in every aspect,
I want to ask you about your mom's work with UNICEF. She was one of the very first celebrities to use the power of her popularity and her public image to bring attention to the urgently pressing problems for children in Africa. She went to some devastating places like Ethiopia and Somalia, and she witnessed terrible, indescribable human suffering. How did she deal with all of that tragedy?
Actually, the instrument that enabled her to be such a wonderful actress, this sort of ability, as she always used to say, to put yourself in the other person's shoes, this sort of amplifier, if you may, turned itself around against her so she could feel the pain of the silent refugee camp with 30,000 people waiting to die. And I think it devastated her. And there are pictures, mostly the Betty Press pictures, which show her the silent rage, and the betrayal, because after the war, we as a society said we're never going to let that happen again, talking about the camps and the camps in Germany. the Holocaust. And here she is 50 years later, 45 years later, actually, in a refugee camp in Somalia. And it's all going on in absolute silence, and nobody's really doing much about it except for this organization. And to go back to a second, you said she's one of the early ones. She was actually the third celebrity ambassador. The first one was, of course, the legendary Danny Kaye, who did it throughout the 50s. I remember him. And then, of course, a few months before she joined, Peter Ustinov, the wonderful actor, had joined as an ambassador. But of course, she's well remembered because of her capacity and her reach to get attention and to move, news and CNN and go on the Larry King and go before the Congress and get them to write a check for $60-70 million over breakfast. I mean, she was able to make some pretty amazing things happen. And I think she really opened a sort of a way for others to emulate her, which is fabulous, which is great. And all in their own right today, it's almost the other way around. You really can't be famous and successful and fortunate, which is really what this is all about, and not give back, And I think a lot of people have done it. Some people have done it in utter silence and discretion. Others have done it maybe a bit over the top, but fantastic.
When your mom talked about the horrific situation in Africa, she used to say, I don't believe in collective guilt, but I do believe in collective responsibility. What do you think she meant by that?
I think that she wanted to sort of turn something negative into something positive. There's no point to sit and sort of wring our hands and blame each other. There was a time for action. This was 32 years ago. She wanted people to understand the value of what was possible at the time. We could have changed the course of history at the time with the 1% fund, which was the sort of proposal at the time. And we kind of did it, but we didn't. And there's a problem. And I have a problem today with the concept of charity, because whether we accept it or not, since we don't seem to be taking responsibility, as you've just mentioned, we're going to have to move away from this charitable system. The charity is basically like you have a terrible accident and you go to the emergency room and you never check out. The average time that a refugee spends in a camp is 16 years, average. That means there are generations of children that are born and grow up and get to be adults in the refugee camp. I was listening the other day to someone, very, very clever economist, who said that he doesn't believe in all this border stuff and all of this sort of building higher and higher walls. We tease ourselves about Trump, but we're doing it. In Europe, we're letting, people die in the Mediterranean Ocean because they don't have the right paperwork. And if they come, we charge them as much money as those pirates have charged them to cross in these very dangerous conditions. So the whole system needs to be reworked. I'm not sure who's going to do it. I'm not sure how it's going to get done. But certainly, if we start at a grassroots level, we have to start refusing charity, because these people deserve a basic education and the tools, because all they want, and that's what she said over and over, all they yearn for is the ability to help themselves. And yet we continuously put them in wheelchairs when they're not paraplegics. So, we have to stop and we have to change the way we help. And there's wonderful sort of these new B Corps, and there's wonderful programs of paying forward loans, to women in Africa. I mean, there's a lot being done. And of course, we can't let in a natural disaster, we cannot let children just die and not do anything about it. So it's very, very difficult. But at the same time, we cannot, and I think we're trying, we cannot let totalitarian politicians rape these countries and put all their money wherever it is that they hide it these days, and get away with it, So our world is becoming every day a more complex system because we have all this technology, and technology is helping us to work it through. But maybe artificial intelligence will see it unemotionally and provide us with a sort of Cartesian and interpretation and understanding of how to move forward and how to fix these things, because these are systems that need to be changed. It's no longer about will. We have the capacity. It's a lack of human will, and therefore we have to find a different avenue to get there.
Well, I think you really hit on it when you described your mother as having the uncanny ability to put herself in other people's shoes. One of her greatest achievements, as you mentioned, was that she addressed the US Congress. The United States increased its funding for Ethiopia by $60 million. That enormous empathy, that one quality which really shone through everything she did, that empathy, I think, is the key at the grassroots level. Because once we try to imagine what it's like for someone else suffering the way you've described, it's almost impossible not to do something about it.
Let's go back to the fist. The empathy is what got her there. And that one thing that I often talk about is I never really saw anybody really misbehave in front of her. People that might have been well known for acting up didn't. And so I think that when Audrey Hepburn gets up and tells you that there's a problem, I think you listen more carefully. And when she tells you that the problem is urgent, I think you listen. And so she had that authority, in part because of who she was and the success she had garnered and the respect that she had acquired. But there was also that ability to get people's attention, and that was because she was sharp.
Well, this may be an odd question, but do you think that because your mom stopped making movies when she did, that she made herself even more valuable to UNICEF because the public was still craving her presence so much?
I don't know. It would be sort of, I don't believe much in predictive systems. We can sort of get some basic understanding of where systems can go, and typically what they show on the outside of the sort of graphs. Typically you can find again at the center, at the core of the problem. But had she continued and done another 4, 5, 10 important films, she would have been still at the top of her career because she had this gift, which is not to be taken for granted. She knew how to choose the material. Some of the best actors in Hollywood sometimes struggle with that, and we've seen it, and we're not going to name names, but it's tough. It's tough, and it has to do ultimately, the core of anyone's success is their mental frame, their, who they are. And ultimately that sort of emerges with time. And we've seen people self-destruct, careers that were absolutely untouchable and perfect. And yet there she is. She only made 17 films, most of them pretty good, but they all sort of contained a certain quality and were good representation of her brand. And so she's pretty untouchable today, I would say.
And yet, Sean, you described her as a star who couldn't see her own light. She was known for being humble, almost to the point of being self-effacing. She never thought of herself as special or particularly worthy of all the adulation and the praise that she received throughout her life. But do you think she got, really deep down inside, do you think she ever really truly understood how universally beloved she was?
I think at the end of her life, she had to, because of the attention and the notes. Over 20 lawn and leaf bags lined the floor of our attic in Switzerland from letters and notes and everything, origami, get well books, alternative medicine, anything you can imagine, we received. And obviously at the time I knew that I could never respond to all of them. And I think in a way I responded to all of them by dedicating the next 30 years of my life to continuing her work. That was the only way I knew how to honor that affection. Yeah.
Well, you drew a distinction in your book between feelings, which cause one to act, and emotions, which cause one to react. You said that your mom was never able to let go of her emotions or find peace within herself. Was that a lesson for you in the way you live your life?
Well, to sort of tie this into the previous question, and you said that she couldn't see herself. And is that not really the definition of beauty, which is not to take yourself that seriously, and not, that I talk about the fawn that's drinking at the creek, and then you step on a twig and it looks up and beautiful eyes, and it doesn't know what it looks like. And I think that's the definition of beauty. And that's the definition of, that's also why she's kind of, so lovable on screen, is that she doesn't take herself so seriously. And she's a wonderful comedian, which is a gene that she's passed on through the generations to my daughter and to my kids. I think, I don't know for sure.
There have been at least 7 biographies written about your mom over the years. Are there any that you would recommend besides your own book?
Yes, I usually talk about the Barry Paris book because he was the first one to sort of, and the last one to be able to go out and actually do the historical research and talk to the people before they all passed away. And so we're sort of, that's the companion book to my book. Mine is more of a spiritual biography, and his is the actual serious biographical work. And so we have this this understanding, and we like each other, and so we always recommend the other book as a sort of it completes the picture.
Yeah, that book is my favorite as well. You wrote something in your book that moved me profoundly, Sean. You said that the greatest gift your mother gave you was the reassurance that you were loved and that you mattered. In my opinion, those two things, being loved and knowing that you matter, are the essence of self-esteem, which is the most important gift a parent can give a child, don't you think?
I remember still to this day, they were interviewing Steven Spielberg's mother, and they said, "What did you do? What's the secret ingredient to creating such a genius?" And she said, "I just loved him to death and got out of the way." And so, yes, I think that sort of ties into this normal childhood, and the fact that she gave me and my brother this extraordinary gift of being there, and taking us into town to buy socks and books, and being there in the morning to sort of go over the homework, and with her hair flat on her head. But that's what kept her real, and that's what keeps the contact, the connection with her public still to this day, I think.
Well, you wrote that your mom's last words were that she regretted not meeting the Dalai Lama. I don't think she was a religious person, but can you talk to me about her spirituality?
She was not, and I think that's the second greatest gift that she gave us, was to let us grow up in an environment, in a home entirely devoid of any ideology of any kind. We had these conversations, which gave birth to this little biography, which has gone on to sell over 2 million copies to date, which is quite extraordinary considering that I'm not a professional book writer. I've done some script doctoring and have some facility with dialogue, but that's about it.
But she was spiritual. She wasn't religious, but she was.
She believed in the miracle of life and of nature, and she saw crocus piercing through the snow as enough. The birth of a child, the gift of life, as enough. She did not believe, and she sort of rebelled against any kind of ideology. Both her parents were deeply, as constant, both political and religious ideology. I start the book by saying, she used to tell that if she had ever written a book, it would start with, "I was born on May 4th, 1929, and I died 6 weeks later." Her mother was a Christian Scientist. My mother got sick with a whooping cough, and she didn't take it to the doctor because she didn't believe in it. And the kid stopped breathing and started to turn blue. And of course, she spanked her back to life. But as a kid, of course, she loved that story and had constantly telling us, "Tell me the story when I died." But maybe she saw her life as a second chance from the get-go, as an opportunity, as a gift.
I wish she could have met the Dalai Lama. I just wonder what kind of conversation.
I think she liked him because I think, first of all, Buddhism is not a religion, but it's more of a life system. I do have its problems with it, especially the fact that there are no women in the system. And, women, Dalai Lama comes from a woman. And so I think that again, regardless of the fact that it's a beautiful, compassionate life system, they're going to have to revise. I know presentism is a problem. At the same time, we're doing that today. We're looking at what people did 300 years ago and judging them by what we see today, which is a big mistake. But she saw him as a human being, as a beautiful human being with a wonderful sense of humor and humanity and compassion. And so as we sat there, as I used to as a little boy, she'd invite me over for a sleepover, on Saturday night. And so we'd make dinner, and then we'd sit there in the darkness with the lights off and chat about this and that. And here, 30 years later, I find myself sitting in an armchair, in a wicker armchair next to her bed, and she's sick, and we know she's not going to last very long. And so, of course, you ask those questions. What are you feeling? What do you regret? What do you wish you had done? And those are the kinds of things that I wanted her to give her a chance to express, because there was nobody else who was going to do it. And that's sort of what came out of those conversations.
Well, it's very telling, and it's very indicative of where her spirit was. So when you watch your mother's movies today, what goes through your mind?
Well, it's difficult to answer that because of these exhibitions and minding after her intellectual property rights, and there's a lot of demand for, even though we do very limited amount of stuff, but I get to see her every day. I get to see film clips and this and that. So in a way, she's really never been gone. She's been there the whole time. I've lost a physical person. Certainly my love for her is still the same as it was before. And I get to see her and listen to her, and there's all this video and all she talks about, how her feelings were about UNICEF and all of that. And so I've learned to live with it in a way, if that's what you're really asking me. Some people inherit a bookstore or a shoe shop. I inherited this legacy, and I'm doing the best I can to sort of fill these larger than life footprints with lots of little steps.
Is it difficult?
No. Difficult would mean that I'm sitting here and wondering if things could have been different. We're not that way in this family. We don't sort of sit around and feel sorry for ourselves. You just get on with it, as she used to say it, in a very Victorian kind of a way. Or no, it's complicated, because protecting a deceased person's rights is very different in many the jurisdictions around the world. There's actually not a huge amount of protection, so you have to protect it a little bit like a brand, which is not something that you really want to do, but you have to. So we have trademarks to protect her name, and those get interpreted differently. So it's a struggle to get people not to do crap, but it's complicated. That's the best way to sort of put it.
But very rewarding.
I would say so, because it enables us to keep her true to herself and to continue to raise a little bit of money for these efforts, even though I've been knocking down the value of charity, and I'm trying to turn that steering wheel, away from that goal in a quarter of a degree to end up in somewhere more constructive. It's not easy, but yes, for sure.
Well, Sean, it's been an enormous honor meeting you and having this chance to speak with you about your dear mom, whom I absolutely adored. Thank you for everything you're doing to perpetuate and honor her incredible legacy.
I think she stands on her own. I'm just the gatekeeper, if you may, and make sure that nobody misbehaves, but I think she speaks for herself. And if she is where she is, I wish I could tell you, yes, I'm a wonderful manager of intellectual property, and I just did what I thought was right. I sort of caught the baton in the air because she was taken away so young at 63, in the middle, not of her acting career, but of her second and most precious career, as she used to put it. And so I felt that should continue. And of course, there had to be a way to pay the rent on the way there, and so I sort of put my career and my wishes aside because I felt that was more valuable. And I think that was the right thing to do.
I think it's what she would have wanted you to do. And from all accounts, you're doing it extremely well. Thank you so much. And thank you for taking the time to appear on our show.
No, what a joy. I'm honored. To the contrary, Harvey. You are illustrious in your own right. And before we met, I've listened to bits and pieces of your other interviews, especially to that reel where everybody is saying how wonderful you are. And it's true. You really have spent the time, and I thank you on her behalf for having taken the time to drill down and not just sort of redo the same interview that many people do, but you've actually read and educated yourself on the subject. And I thank you for that. That says a lot about you, and good on you, as they say in Australia.
Well, I want you to know it was an enormous honor and a privilege and a pleasure. I absolutely adored your mom. Our guest has been Sean Hepburn Ferrer, son of the one and only Audrey Hepburn and Mel Ferrer. My name is Harvey Brownstone. Thank you to my producer, Steve Silver, my director of programming, Deborah Batsafin, my production assistant, Rosa Puzo, my PR director, Laurie Towers, and my entire team at the XPTV1 network in the UK. Thank you all for joining us. See you next time.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to check out all the great interviews on the Harvey Brownstone Interviews YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell to be notified when new videos are posted.